Hebrews chapter 11 is one of those chapters that you can go to when nothing seems to be going the right way. When you look at your life and you see all the things that you've done wrong, the sins that you've committed, the mistakes that you've made, and you think to yourself, what would the God in heaven want to do with me at all? Why would He have anything to do with somebody like me? Hebrews chapter 11 is one of those chapters that you can go to and you can read through it, and it can kind of help you get over those things. Because when you look at the people who are listed in this chapter, they're not perfect people. None of them have done everything that God desires. None of them have made themselves complete in and of their own doing. But what they did do was believe. What they did do was have faith in God's promises. That's kind of how the chapter starts. Now, faith is the reality of what is hoped for, the proof or the conviction of what is not seen. And by it, our ancestors of old were approved. Well, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that you can just hope that good things are going to happen, that you just believe that everything is going to be okay, and that's faith. It doesn't mean that you just kind of throw yourself out there without any evidence, without any knowledge about what God has said. But faith is the belief that God will fulfill what He has promised. So there has to be something as the foundation for faith, and that foundation is God's Word. The foundation is God's promises. In each one of these instances, God communicates to an individual, and the individual believes God. They have faith in what God says, so they do what God says. Consider Abraham, who is called by God to go to this new place. He doesn't tell him where it is. He said, just go. I'm going to show you where it is. Well, what does Abraham do? He packs up his family and he leaves. Abraham later is told to offer his son as a sacrifice. Now, this is the son, Isaac, that God said is going to be the promised child. This is the child of the promise. This is the one through whom all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed, through Isaac. And now God's telling me to kill Isaac? How do we make this work? Well, Abraham didn't just throw his hands up in disgust and walk away and say, well, obviously God doesn't know what He's doing. Abraham knew that God's promise about Isaac was true. Abraham also knew that God's desire for this sacrifice was true. So what did he do? He had two things that were apparently contradictory. Well, he examined them and considered God's power, and he realized, even if I take out my knife and I slaughter my son, God can raise him from the dead. God has said Isaac is the one through whom all the nations of the earth will be blessed. God is going to keep that promise. I don't see it yet, it's not here yet, but I know God will keep that promise. Therefore, God must be willing to raise him from the dead. And when he's going up the mountain with Isaac, he turns back to his buddies and he says, we'll come back. Wait here. Because he believed God. And so as he was going up the mountain, he knew that God was going to keep both of His promises. He knew that God was going to work all of this stuff out, and God was going to make everything happen exactly the way that He said it would. And so when you go through this list, all of these people, it's not that they're perfect. It's not that they always did the right thing. Abraham had a lying problem. Abraham had an obedience problem at times. It's not that Abraham's perfect, it's that Abraham had faith. Sarah didn't believe that God was going to send her a son, a child. When she heard it, she laughed. But she changed her mind. She had faith, and she did everything that was going to be required to have that child. She believed. You go through and you look at all the other people. Moses didn't want to go, and he didn't want to talk to Pharaoh at first, but ultimately he came to have faith. He came to trust that what God was saying is what God was going to do. Moses had faith. He wasn't perfect. He had faith. Noah had faith to build the ark. Abel had faith to offer a better sacrifice than Cain. You go through all of these things. It talks about Rahab's faith. It talks about the faith of Jephthah, Samson, David, Samuel, the prophets. What did they do? Incredible things. It says, by faith they conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire, escaped the sword, gained strength after being weak. They became mighty in battle. They put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead, raised to life again. Why? Because they believed what God said. God is the one who's doing all the work in each one of these situations, but He does it through their faith. They have faith and they believe. The Apostle Paul would say, you are saved by grace through faith. In order to get to God's grace, we have to have faith. Our faith is what gets us to God's grace. We have faith when we hear what God says, we believe what God says, and we do what God says. It will never be because we're good enough. It will never be because we've done all the right things. It will never be because we have finally obtained holiness. It will always be because we have faith. That is why the New Testament talks about the righteousness that comes through faith. I believe what God said. I know God is going to keep His word. And so I'm going to do what God says. And when I fail, I know that God has promised that He'll forgive me. Everything is based upon God's promises. And so as we read through the Scriptures, focus on God's promises. Make that the forefront of what you're looking at, what you're reading, what you're thinking about, God's promises. Because it's God's word that is powerful. It's God's promises that will sustain us. We just have to listen. We have to believe. And when we act upon what God has said, then we have faith. So as you're reading through the Bible, this is Hebrews chapter 11.